The great thing about hand-cut dovetails is there's really only one skill involved in this whole process. If you can follow a line with a handsaw, the rest of this joint is just following a series of steps. So I'm going to show you all the tools that I use, and I'm going to walk you through each step of this process. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about handsaws and my approach to using a handsaw. I've got two different types of saws here. I've got a Japanese saw and I've got a Western saw. Now, dovetails can be cut with either one of these saws. I started out using the Japanese saw because I do find that it's easier. There's something more natural about using it. The main difference here is the Japanese saw, also called a pull saw, because it cuts on the pull, and it's the exact opposite for the Western saw. It's actually, the teeth are configured to where it cuts on the push. And this is a Lie-Nielsen. It's about a $120 saw. It's a fantastic saw, whereas the Japanese saw, this is about a $40 saw, and it's disposable. You can't sharpen this, you can't sharpen this. It comes from Lie-Nielsen, ready to go out of the box. Very sharp saw, and I really do like it. It took a little while to kind of get the technique down, but once I figured out how to use it, this is my go-to saw. I don't even touch this one anymore. I'm going to be using my Western saw through this entire process. I've got a piece of pine here. I'm going to put in my vise, and I'm going to show an exercise that I do. Anytime it's been a while since I've actually used a hand saw, I like to do this. But I like to get a square board and take my square and make a mark straight down like so. I like to get my dovetail saw and make a curve parallel to that line as close as I can. Not on top of the line, but just really close to it, and try to keep it perfectly parallel. I'll start by pulling the saw just a hair. Then I like to move over, maybe a quarter of an inch or so. We'll make a cut that's parallel to that line. You definitely want to let the saw do all the work. You don't really want to put any force behind it. And I find that if I concentrate on pushing the saw with the bottom part of my palm, it almost creates a natural lifting motion. That really is a great exercise. Now let's take a look at all the tools we're going to be using before we get started. We've already talked about the dovetail saw. We're also going to need a bevel gauge, a dovetail marker, a good quality square, something to write with, a wheel gauge, a marking knife, a mallet, and a nice set of chisels, and they do need to be sharp. We're probably only going to use maybe 2 or 3 different sizes. We're just about ready to get started on these dovetails, but first let's take a closer look at this joint. One of the great things about the dovetail joint is these two boards will only go together in one direction, which creates mechanical strength, because they'll pull apart like this, but they won't pull apart like this, which is why you see these on the sides of drawers, because that constant action, this joint will not pull apart. Now the two parts that make up this joint you have your tail board. Looks kind of like the tail of a dove. But those dovetails, they're cut straight across the board, but at a bevel. Down at a bevel like that. And it's just the opposite with the pin board. The pins are actually cut at a miter degree and straight down. Now to me, this is important because the first thing you have to do is decide if you're going to cut your pins or your tails first. Now I always cut my tails first because I find the bevel cut to be more difficult. And the thing to keep in mind, you can cut the pins first or the tails first, but you're gonna cut that first board, whether it's your pins or your tails, and then that's going to become your template, and you're going to transfer that onto the other board. Therefore, the second board you cut, whether it's your tails or your pins, it has to be the most accurate. So the one that I do first is what I consider to be the most difficult cut. When I cut this bevel, if say I get off my line by 2 degrees, doesn't really matter because that 2 degrees is going to on my pin board whenever I transfer that over. So I've got a piece of walnut and a piece of poplar. I thought that would be a good contrast for this demonstration, and let's go ahead and get started. I start by arranging the boards, and I mark each outside face. This is to prevent me from getting confused later on during this process. I'm also going to put a 1 in the top of each corner. That way I know those two sides go together. When building a box or doing something with multiple sides, it can get very confusing. It's always a good idea to mark your boards. In this case, I'm using the poplar board as my tail board, and I'm using the walnut board as my pin board. I'm going to use my wheel gauge to mark a shoulder on each board. I set the wheel gauge to the thickness of each board. In this case, I only have to do it once because both of my boards are the exact same thickness. I mark the shoulder on my tail board all the way around, including the edge grain. On my pin board, I just mark the front face and the inside face. I'm ready to lay out my tails on my tail board, and this can be done using either a sliding bevel gauge or a dovetail marker. I'm just going to use a dovetail marker, it's a little bit easier. These can be shop made or you can buy them. This one came from Veritas. I made some marks on my tail board so my dovetails would be evenly spaced. This dovetail marker works really well because it allows you to draw the beveled line but also the line straight across the end grain at the same time. I use my knife and my square, and I go over the shoulder mark that I made earlier just to make sure that it's well established. Now that I got my tails laid out and I've got all my waist clearly marked, I'm ready to cut. Two things you want to keep in mind when you do this: you don't want to saw past your shoulder mark, and you also always want to cut on the waist side of the line. If you cut right on the line, you're going to end up with a very loose joint. Alright, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and remove both ends of this piece. I use a chisel and I push it up against the knife mark I made across the edge grain, And I just relieve some of that material before pulling out my handsaw. This ensures a clean shoulder. And I do the other side. Some people like to use a fret saw to remove the material between the tails. I just like to go at it with my chisels. When chopping out this material, be sure to slightly undercut this to ensure that you don't have a high spot in the middle. A little bit of cleanup and we're ready to make the pins. I'm ready to transfer my tails over to my pin board, and I'm going to do this using this hand plane. I'm going to use it to stabilize my tail board. The hand plane really makes a nice stable surface for this. Just want to get everything good and flush. I've got my pins laid out and I'm going to remove the waste just like I did on my tail board. Alright, let's see how we did. Oh yeah, that's a really good fit. I think we did a good job. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of glue to this joint. Well, that concludes today's video. I do hope you learned something and I hope you give this joint a try. Be sure to click on the subscribe button for future content. And if you have any comments or questions, or if you just want to make fun of me, be sure to do that down below. And we'll see you next time.